Well, it is wonderful to be here. It's like coming home when I come to FCCI. I love so many of you that I have wonderful memories with, and my parents. This was one of their very favorite groups to be with. They always said yes whenever FCCI needed them to do anything, and if it wasn't for their involvement, I wouldn't be involved with you. And now it's a joy for me to have my son coming in tonight and speaking the next day or so. And as I believe was shared this morning, going through a hard time in the last about 6 weeks. Both my parents had multiple hospital stays. My dad had 3 ambulance rides to the hospital himself because his heart was acting up, and ultimately got a pacemaker put in and trying to stabilize some things. But my mother, much more seriously, has liver cancer. And she's just she is the strongest woman, one of the strongest people I've ever known. Many of you know her. She raised 5 kids while my dad was traveling all over starting churches and ministering, and at one point had 4 teenage sons and was doing a lot of single parenting with 4 teenage sons. And like I said, she's the strongest woman I know. She was a typical mother of primarily boys. I think she raised my sister like a boy too. She was the 5th one, so by that time she had a system down. But she was also a typical mother of boys. She could drive you crazy, but she would be like a mother bear if anyone was hurting her boys. Or I'll never forget one day, just met someone that had my youngest brother, Norm, as a professor. Years ago, Norm he could be a little bit obnoxious at times. And one day, the biggest bully in the entire neighborhood, he was a couple years older than I was, but just a nasty, nasty human being. The kind of person that would swing cats over his head by the tail and get into all kinds of vicious fights with knives, and was in trouble with the police, I think, while he was still in preschool. And he showed up. He got mad at my brother one day and showed up at the door, rang the doorbell to inform my mother he was going to kill one of her sons. This is the most terrifying guy. I mean, all of us kids were terrified of this guy. He's telling my mother he's going to kill her son. Well, what do you do with that? She grabbed a broom and chased the kid all the way out into the street. She's a tough lady. Nothing intimidated her, and so I was planning to be here yesterday with my wife, and our bags were packed. The doctor came by and said my mother had maybe 2 days to live, and so we knew it was short. And so we canceled our flights. I went and got my dad, went to see Mom one more time, and just left. I was there, pushed Dad up next to her bed, and just let them spend time together. My mom can't really keep her eyes open much anymore, and so I thought I just wasn't going to be able to make it here at all. And later, yesterday evening, I just talked to my wife, and she often has a lot of wisdom for me. And now we have to plan for a funeral maybe this Saturday. But she said, "You've said your goodbyes. You have spent a lot of time with your mother. She knows you love her. But you also have a son that's going to be finding his way over at FCCI." And I just felt like I've got the past at home, and I've got the future coming here, and I'm trying to be faithful to the past and yet send the future off and be their encourager as well. And so just felt that the Lord just released me to come, and knowing how much my parents love FCCI, I just knew that they would be glad that I came. So I'm keeping tabs. I do appreciate your prayers for her. On the way here, I was on the phone with the hospice people, and they're discharging her from the hospital today because they can't do any more for her. And so perhaps by dinner time tonight they'll take her home, and we've got all the kids around the family and around the clock kind of being there with her. So appreciate your prayers for her. We've had some special times. A week or two ago, when she could still kind of walk with some help, I took her for a walk into the courtyard of their assisted living complex, and we sat down at a bench, and we just had a beautiful time. She said, you'd have to know my mother, but she said, "Richard, I'm not afraid to die." She said, "I know where I'm going." She said, "I know, I'm not afraid to die." But she said, "But I've had a delightful time living," she said. and she's one who never wanted to miss out on anything. That's going to be the only frustration at her funeral, was all of her favorite people will be there and she won't be able to visit like she always did. But we sat there and she said, I'm ready to go right now. I'm ready to go. And I said, "Well, Mom, I think the Lord," I said, "you don't need any more memories. You've got all the memories any person could possibly have. Wonderful memories of great friends, great works of God. But I said, there's a few people that you might just give one more memory to." And I said, "Just sitting here with you in this courtyard." I said, "You've just given me another memory I'll never forget. Just talking with my mother about what heaven will be like." And I said, "Mom, when you get there, you're not going to see any clocks on the wall. There's no time. You won't see a calendar anywhere. They don't go by days there." I said, it goes so fast. I said, "You'll still be in the lobby just meeting everybody," as she does as an extrovert. And I said, "and that you'll turn around and your family will be coming right in behind you." And I said, "It'll be that quick." I said, "We'll be right behind you, Mom. Don't worry." So I said, "But we made another memory today." I said, "I'm just glad God kept you around through this time as well." So I'm torn, but I think in part what I appreciate about even just this topic that I'm going to talk with you about is investing in the future. And I'm living that out. As I said, I think of the past. I was spending a lot of time caring for my mom and helping her move around. The last few days at home, I had to literally lift her out of her chair and put her into a wheelchair and lift her up and set her back down. And she said, "Richard, I'm just so sorry that I'm just so much trouble for you. I'm sorry that I'm causing you so much extra work." I said, "Mom, I'm still paying off my debt to you." I said, "I still am so deeply in debt to you, what you've done." I said, "I don't think I can get it all paid off in time." I said, "So let me keep loving on you, because I'm still way, way in your debt for all you did for me." But as I said, the challenge is I'm trying to honor the past. I'm trying to honor what's gone behind me. But I'm also torn by the fact I'm still trying to launch my kids. All three of my kids are in ministry. Mike, that you'll meet tomorrow, is a church planter in Canada. Is writing books with his younger brother who works for our ministry. His sister works for our ministry. And they are the future. Folks, I'll tell you something. When you are with someone you know very shortly will be looking face to face with Jesus, you're reminded that all of our lives are brief. We don't have a lot of time. None of us do. And you leave one of those meetings and you just think to yourself, I can't waste my time. I can't waste my time doing things that won't matter. And as my parents have gotten older, one thing I've noticed, they need less and less. That we moved them out of their big house a couple years ago, got rid of tons of stuff, moved them into a pretty sizable 2-bedroom apartment, and then that got to be too much. We had to weed a bunch of that stuff out. And now we've been looking even for a smaller place until this all happened. As you get older, you just don't need a lot. But what I've noticed is the relationships you have are forever. The people you invested in are forever. The stuff, one day you'll just get tired of dusting or paying taxes on or accounting for it. But the people, those relationships will last forever. And so if you want to invest your life in some place you don't ever have to cut back or regret wasting time on, put it in people. And so I want to talk to you just a little bit about that in these moments. And much I could say about that, but I know that who I am is because my parents, the older generation, saw something in me and invested in me. I didn't know it at the time, but when I was born, You know, I was born in the Jurassic era where fathers couldn't be in the birthing room. They couldn't even be in the nursery. My dad would stand behind a glass wall and look at his son, his firstborn child, in the nursery, and could hardly wait until I was released to go home so he could finally hold me and get his hands on me. And the first night, apparently, they had a little nursery where I was put. And my grandparents on my mother's side had come as well to see their new grandson. And my grandparents would get up in the night, go use the restroom, get some water. And of course, every time they got up, they had to just peek into the nursery to check out their grandson. But my grandparents, years later, told me all through the night, as one of them was getting up through the night, they'd peek into the nursery and they would see my father praying over me. And they kept thinking, well, I'll come back later when Henry's done. They'd come back an hour later, Henry wasn't done yet, still praying over me. And God, in that first night at home, God basically told my dad that God was going to use this son in some kind of ministry. And my dad never told me that. But because God alerted my father to what he wanted to do in my life, my dad adjusted his life. You know, my dad always taught, when you see where God's working, you join him. And so he just kept saying, God, show me how to join your activity in my oldest son's life. And there were years, especially in high school, where I started to struggle a bit and rebel, and I got kind of terrified that God might indeed be calling me into ministry, and I wasn't keen on the idea, largely because I didn't want to speak in public. And I'll never forget one day, I may have shared here before, but it was the most terrifying night of my life where my best friend came over to my house and he'd been playing in the occult and he got involved over his head with the demonic. And 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, he's knocking on my door, scared to death that he has been playing with something far more evil and powerful than he bargained for. And I'll just never forget, 11 o'clock at night, we're down in our basement, my two brothers under me and my friend, and I'll never forget the terrified look on this young man's face as he said, he just pled with me to do something to set him free. And I tried to pray, I tried to do whatever I could to help him, and it didn't have any impact whatsoever. I'd been running from God. Have you ever tried to pray after you've been running from God? There's not a lot of power there. I hadn't been praying for a while, and all of a sudden I need God to answer my prayers, but God and I have not been talking. And I knew even as the words were coming out of my mouth that God was not even listening to my prayer. And so all I knew to do was get my dad. And it's 2:30 in the morning, Sunday morning. My dad's got to get up and preach that morning, but he gets up. I went in, I said, Dad, you got to get up. Well, why? Richard, it's 2:30 in the morning. I said, well, I know, Dad, you got to get up. Well, why? I said, well, because I've got someone here that really needs your help. Well, can I talk to him later, maybe after lunch? No, Dad, you got to get up now. And so my dad puts on his house coat, puts on his fuzzy slippers, and goes into the living room. My two other brothers dragged this boy up the stairs, dragged him across the floor, sat him in a chair in the living room. My brothers and I raced back downstairs. Whatever was going to happen, we didn't want to be there when it did. And it was the most evil, demonic, dark, terrifying experience that any of us had ever had in our life. We were scared to death, and we're going to leave this boy alone with my dad, who's just been awakened at 2:30 in the morning from a sound sleep. And I'll never forget, a few moments later, hearing my dad calling down, saying, boys, come upstairs. And we came up, we took a look at our friend, and he was in perfect peace, perfect peace. He'd been set free. And I'll never forget, my dad sat us down, he said, boys, you can't ever get careless in your walk with God, because you never know when someone will come knocking on your door. And you can't race to get your prayer life caught up in that moment. You can't hurry up your walk with God in the moment. You gotta be ready, because you just never know when someone's going to need your walk with God to be current and up to date. And I'll never forget that. The next, watching my dad, 3 of us had prayed all that we knew to pray, and we couldn't set our friend free. My dad is awakened from a dead sleep at 2:30 in the morning while still in his pajamas and slippers. He's overcoming the powers of evil there in our living room. And I just thought, I want to be a man of God like that. And so I began a journey. And my dad has walked with me for decades, trying to help me to be that kind of man as well. And so I know when I do some things that I don't take credit for pretty well anything I do, because I know that it's been the generations before me that have passed it on to me. And so I want to talk to you about what does it look like when you do the same, when you invest your life in the next generation of leaders, in business, in your church, certainly in your own home, among your grandkids. You know, one last thing just to share with you that was so poignant for me was that yesterday morning, even as I'm hearing, I walked out. I teach a Bible study at my church on Sunday mornings. I just finished teaching, and I got a message, your mother has 2 days to live. But I went from there into the auditorium of our church, and my 2 oldest grandsons were baptized yesterday. They're twins. And they both took a stand for Christ. And I thought, even as their great-grandparents are beginning to pass from the scene, their great-grandkids are stepping up and saying, we're going to follow the same Jesus that our great-grandparents followed. And the next generation is just lining up and following just like their great-grandparents and their great-great-grandparents did as well. The generations continue. And so what does it look like when you invest in the next generation? There's a lot that I could say to you, but let me just mention one thing first, and that is, you know, we talk a lot about mentoring and coaching, but one thing I should just sort of put on the table just to mention, and that is that we all have a particular calling, and that is what I call everyone's commission, which is, of course, the Great Commission, right? In Matthew 28, verses 18 to 20, it says, Jesus, in the Gospel of Matthew, the last thing he says before he ascends to heaven, it says there's some there that they see him and they're worshiping him. Others are doubting. But it says Jesus drew near to them, and then you know that he's drawing near because what he's about to tell them is so important they can't miss it. And then he tells them, go, therefore, and make disciples. And of course, the command there is to make disciples. The command is every one of you needs to be making a disciple. And what's interesting is he doesn't say, now those of you who just worship me, you need to make disciples. He doesn't say if you're an apostle, you need to make disciples. There's doubters in the crowd. He doesn't say, those of you who doubted, you don't need to listen to these next instructions because I don't want you to make a disciple. He's telling everybody. He's saying, listen, if you're a Christian, if you're a Jesus follower, I'm commanding you to make disciples. And then he goes on to say, and teaching them to observe everything that I've commanded you. Which means you have not made a disciple unless the person you discipled is now doing everything Jesus commanded. And by the way, what's one of the things Jesus commanded? Was to make disciples. And so let me just state it this way. If you are not making disciples who are themselves making disciples, then you are not fulfilling this commandment. And if I were to walk around this room, now you might say, well, I'm just not the mentoring type. I don't have anyone in a mentoring relationship. Well, okay, we'll talk about that, but none of us is exempt from making disciples, which is inspiring other people to want to follow Jesus as fervently and joyfully as you are. And to be so excited about being a disciple that they're going out and making disciples themselves. I'll tell you what, that was Jesus' strategy to turn the world upside down. Jesus' strategy was not to fill stadiums and have revivalists preaching to them. He commanded the whole spectrum of Christianity and said, every one of you get out there and make a disciple. And there's no question that you don't have to ask if you have the spiritual gift of discipleship making or not. We're all commanded to do that. And I think sometimes we keep trying to come up with some other gimmick that the church can grow. If we got back to every one of us making disciples, the church would be overflowing into the streets. And so we're all commanded to make disciples. And basically when Jesus taught people, he did three things. First of all, he taught them. And we're pretty good at that in our church. And secondly, he sent them, and he basically said, now go practice what I just taught you. Go try it out. I don't want it to stay in your head. I want you to go out and live what I taught you till it's in your life. And then third, they'd come back, and he would process with them. And he would say, okay, how did it go? What did you learn from that? And so I just want to kind of lay that out there, first of all, just to say, we all should be I should be able to go up to every one of you and say, who are you discipling right now? Because if you're not discipling anyone, you are disobeying the last thing Jesus commanded us to do. There's no exemption. Folks, who are you discipling? And I'll tell you what, I made a fool of myself yesterday morning. My daughter-in-law pointed that out, but I was able to stand behind the baptistry where my two oldest grandsons were getting baptized. And I didn't realize I was in the video. I thought it was off to the side. And so I'm clicking my phone pictures of them going under and them testifying, and I'm wiping tears from my eyes. My two oldest that generation, my grandkids are following Jesus. And afterward, my daughter-in-law said, do you know you just, the whole time they could see you on the big screen just taking pictures and with a big smile on your face. And I said, but I can't help it. I can't think of anything that gives me more joy than watching my grandchildren's age following my Jesus. After watching me and watching my kids, they've said we want to follow Jesus too. So let me kind of shift gears for just the last bit here, and I want to just talk to you about an interesting story that happens in 1 Kings chapter 19. 1 Kings, of course, 1 Kings 18 is one of those profound chapters where one of the greatest men of God in the Bible is in his heyday, Elijah. And in chapter 18, Elijah is in his prime. He is at the top. He has a showdown. 850 false prophets on Mount Carmel, one against 850. And there's King Ahab, that ungodly king, and 850 to 1, odds are, it's rare that the odds have ever been that steep against the people of God, but he's not fearful. In fact, he's taunting the 850. He's trying to make them mad. It's like, if it's 850 to 1, no point in making them mad. It's already going to be, the odds are huge. But he's so confident. And then he gets up and he prays a simple, confident prayer, and the fire falls. And I'll tell you what, every time I read that, it sends a trembling in my spirit when it says, then the fire fell. And I think to myself, has there ever been a time in my life where the fire fell? Has there ever been a moment I could look and say, now that was God? You can't explain that any other way. Now you can explain this by my hard work, by my leadership ability, by the fact I didn't give up, but you can't explain that by anything except God. What can you point to in your life and say only God could have done that? Well, that calling down fire from heaven's not bad, is it? And then he that same day, he goes up to the top of Mount Carmel, prays, and stops a 3.5-year drought that began when he preached a sermon at the beginning of chapter 17. I mean, this guy, his prayers change weather patterns in 3.5-year droughts. I mean, the guy, you think about what he's accomplished. And by the way, in chapter 17, just for good measure, he raises a dead person. Now, if you had that on your resume, well, would you not kind of bring that up in casual conversation? It's like, you're talking about the football games yesterday. Yeah, it reminds me about when I raised a dead guy. It's like, you'd want to, every time you saw a fire, you walk by a fireplace, reminds me of the time I called a pillar of fire to come down. Like, what? You'd have to work it in, right? Like, that would just be the peak. I mean, it's like the peak. And you would think after that, of course, how could anyone ever lose confidence in God? How could you ever lose hope? But what the interesting thing, here's a guy who can call fire from heaven, raise dead people, change the weather, and yet by chapter 19, he's so discouraged he wants to die. And he resigns, he fires his office help. He says, I'm done, I quit, I want to die. And
I've studied this a lot. I've tried to figure out how could you be calling fire down one moment and then be ready to die in discouragement the next. I think in part what the problem was Elijah really wanted to bring revival. And he thought for sure, you call fire down, it's like being there before joint meeting of Congress. And there's the president, there's the Senate, there's the House of Representatives, the congressmen, and saying, I'm going to show all of you right now that my God is real. And then you call fire to come down in a spectacular display, and everybody starts spontaneously shouting out, the Lord God is God. Would you not think that would be enough to turn the tide of evil in your nation and see revival begin to spread? By the way, are any of you praying for revival in America today? Would you not, like a fire from heaven, wouldn't that be kind of a timely thing to have happen right now? You're thinking, I know where I'd like the fire to fall, too. It's like, but Elijah did all of that, which arguably were some of the greatest miracles in the Bible, in history, and revival still didn't come. And so he basically thinks if a ball of fire from heaven can't convince people to turn from their sin and their evil ways, what's it going to take? And he kind of gives up. And so he goes all the way to Mount Sinai, goes into a cave, curls up in a fetal position and just says, I want to die. And then I love that in chapter 19, God comes and he says, Elijah, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? Now, he might have been talking about his geography. He might have been saying, the last thing I recall, I told you to go to Mount Carmel. What are you doing 350 miles in the wrong direction? But I think what he was probably talking about was his spiritual condition. He probably was saying, I remember not long ago when you were confidently serving me, victoriously serving me, and now you want to die? You want to quit? How did you let discouragement get inside you so quickly? And then I love what he does. God basically says to Elijah, you can't quit yet because your best days still lie ahead of you, not behind you. Now, folks, if you've raised a dead guy and you've called fire from heaven, I can understand if you figure your best days were behind you. Things aren't going to get any better than that. But God, listen to this. God says your best days are still to come. And it won't be because you call fire down on anybody. It won't be because you raise a dead person. Do you know what it's going to be? Because you're going to invest in the next generation. I hope you don't miss that. This is a guy who's raised dead people, called fire down, changed the climate. And God's saying, but if you want to do something really exciting, invest in the next generation. You're going to appoint 2 kings, king over Aram, a king over Israel. You're going to appoint Elisha, this farm boy, to take your place and be a prophet with a double portion of your spirit. Folks, I tell you what, don't miss the excitement that can be yours when you touch the future by investing in the next generation. And so I want you just to see, I'm going to just kind of summarize for you in a few moments, just 4 things that Elijah did. And I'm going to just summarize. You know his story well. What are the 4 things that at least that Elijah did with Elisha? And the first one was, you need to learn to invest in the ones God gives you. God told Elijah who to mentor, who to anoint, who to bless. Elijah didn't ask everybody, he didn't get open for applications. He didn't say, if you'd like to be mentored by me, I'd like to take your applications. We'll keep the window open until next Tuesday. He invested in the people God gave him. And you know what? Have you ever tried to force your mentoring on anybody? Have you ever approached someone and said, you really need a lot of mentoring, I'd be willing to help? I've never found that to be helpful. I had a guy one time who actually emailed me and said, Richard, would you mentor me? And I wasn't sure. I wanted to be open to whatever God said. So I said, I answered him. I said, well, yeah, I'd be open to that. I said, I travel a lot, and so I'm not sure if I have a regular day we could mentor, but I said, usually Fridays sometimes are good, or Thursdays, or maybe Monday when I get back, and I'm looking on my calendar, and I'm suggesting a number of dates that could possibly work to get started, and maybe some things we could do. And all of a sudden, I just felt like the Spirit just checked me and said, wait, hold on. Yeah, that's just sort of typical me. Like if I'm going to do something, I'm just like, let's jump in and get this thing going. He said, I just felt like the Lord said, just back up, delete everything, all the plans, all the dates, just say, I'd be open to it. What do you have in mind? And I hit send. Do you know what? We never replied to the email. We never did do that. I was going to hand it to him on a silver platter. God was saying, no, he doesn't want it enough. He doesn't want it. If he really wanted the man, don't make it easy on someone you're mentoring. You'll change their life if you mentor them. Don't squander your life-changing moments on people that aren't that interested or willing to pay the price. I never forget, I was at my church one day in Canada, and my brother was the pastor. I was a seminary president, and it was Youth Sunday, and so all the young people, the youth were preaching. Both my sons preached their first sermons in Youth Sunday at our church. And, usually the sermons weren't that great, but you just loved on the teenagers, and you blessed them, and you encouraged the teenagers who sang special music, the teenagers who ushered and collected the offering and so on. But there was one young man, he's about 22 years old, and he worked at a factory, and he wasn't a youth, he was a youth worker, he was a volunteer. His name was Mitch, and my kids loved Mitch. This kid just clearly loved the teenagers in the church, and they just flocked to him. And he got up at a certain point, and in about 1 minute, this factory worker just basically told us all how wonderful our kids were. And we ought to be grateful to God that God had given us these teenagers, because some of the parents weren't so certain that their children were a blessing at that time. And he was telling them, I just love them. I love who they are and who they're becoming. And anyway, as he said that, the Spirit within me, I just felt like God just said, there's a young man that loves young people. There's someone that he could spend the rest of his life working with young people. And I just felt like God said, go up and speak into that young man's life. And so the service was over. And normally you'd be looking for teenagers to bless, but I saw Mitch up at the front. I walked up to Mitch, and he was talking to someone, so I waited. Finally, he's free. I said, hey, Mitch, listen, as I heard you speaking today, I just was so impressed with your heart for ministry, for the young people. And I said, I just felt I need to come and ask you, have you ever thought that God might be calling you into ministry? And if so, I'm telling you, I think you'd make a great minister, and I'd be willing to walk with you and encourage you and help you. And so I'm waiting for the guy's response. He just stared at me. He never even said thank you. He never said a word. He just stared at me. It got awkward after a few moments. And I realized, okay, that was not the Spirit's prompting. Someone else must have been prompting me to do that, because this is not going the direction I thought it would go. I thought he'd be excited to have me want to mentor him, and he just like his mouth was just open. He just staring at me. It was so awkward. I finally said, well, if you ever want to get together for coffee, just let me know. Apparently you don't, though, because you're not even talking to me. So see you later. And I thought, whoa, boy, I got that one wrong. Went home, had lunch, and the phone rings, and I answer it. It's Mitch. He said, I am so sorry. I apologize. I'm so sorry for this morning. I said, well, what was going on there? He said, Mr. Blackaby, I just got to tell you, he said, the last month or so, he said, I just feel like God has been just all over me, telling me that I need to go into ministry. But he said, I'm a factory worker. I've never been to college. He said, I don't know that I could do it. I don't know that I have what it takes. And he said, I keep trying to put it off and try to not hear God's voice. And he said, it just gets louder and louder. And I've been so miserable, I haven't even been able to sleep the last week. And he said, finally, just last night, he said, it got so bad, I actually said to God, all right, God, if this is from you, you're going to have to send a messenger to me to make it clear. And he said, the next day you're standing there saying, you felt God impressing you that you had to come and tell me that I would make a wonderful minister. And you'd be willing to walk with me and help me become that minister. He said, I was in so much shock, he said. I couldn't even respond. He said, I couldn't talk. He said, I want to have that coffee. He's a youth minister to this day. But I'll tell you what, don't force yourself on people. But if God gave you an employee, if it's a new hire and he's just eager to learn and just soaks up the time that you invest in them, or maybe it's someone in your church, maybe it's one of your own kids, but look to see and ask God, who are you sending to me? Who are you putting on my heart? I have people all the time saying, I'd be willing to mentor someone, I just don't know who I would do. Who would I mentor? I'd say, well, open your spiritual eyes and ask God to show you, and he'll let you know. Secondly, you can't give what you don't have. By the way, how would you like to have Elijah come up to you and say, would you like me to share with you what I've learned about walking with God? I'd say, yeah. Tell me how you do that fire thing. Like, I really like that. And when you parted the Jordan River and we walked across on dry land like that, I would really like to know how to do that. Like, when Elijah comes, he's got stuff to share, right? But and by the way, that's why one of the greatest things you can do for the one you're mentoring is keep filling your cup up. I know people that want to mentor, when they sit down with someone to mentor, what they're doing is they're telling them stuff they did 25 years ago. Let me tell you when I was your age, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Well, that's great. But folks, do you got anything more current than that? I want someone to mentor me who's got a story from this morning of their time with God, of what God taught them last week about leadership that they never knew before. Don't tell me about 30 years ago when you had to forgive a business associate that did you wrong. Tell me about how you forgave someone last week and how God guided you in the midst of all that's happening right now in our world. Do you have something fresh? My dad was kind of the classic of that. I describe my dad's whole ministry as just ministering out of the overflow. It was always current with my dad. It was always what had just happened with my dad. I remember years ago when experiencing God was fairly new out, there was a conference center that really wanted my dad to come and speak on it one week, but Dad was going to be in Africa at the time. He's going to speak for 2 weeks in Africa. I was there with my mom. And so they asked me to fill in for my dad. So if you can imagine, that's like Elisha filling in for Elijah, it's like, but I'm there speaking. But my parents were going to get home the day before the conference ended, and my mom was eager to get one of her kids, her firstborn, and so they were going to drive 4 hours from Atlanta to where I was, pick me up, bring me back to their house to spend a couple of days. So I said to my parents, do you think there's any way you could get here by 1 o'clock that day, and I'll just have Dad teach the last seminar for me? And so I told everybody the first day, on Friday, we may have a surprise. My dad might show up in time, and I'm going to let him speak if he gets here. Well, people said, okay, we'll see you next Friday. They weren't sure they're going to come hear me all week, but they're coming Friday. So it's looking like my parents are going to make it, but what I didn't realize at the time was that remember the Rwandan genocide that took place where there millions of people were slaughtered and all kinds of violence? Well, that had just happened. And my dad had come in and he's going to speak to all the missionaries. And the missionaries had just been watching bloodbaths. One missionary told my dad, they said, I was at the river and I literally watched entire congregations floating down the river, all macheted to death. He said, I'm pointing out the deacons and the pastor and the staff, all of them dead. And one of the female missionaries had been raped by marauding guerrillas at the time, and there'd been a miscarriage because of all the stress. And these missionaries, there were 2 different meetings on different sides of Africa, and both weeks these people just came in absolutely empty. One missionary said, I can't cry anymore. I've cried so much. I don't even have any tears anymore. My body wants to cry. I've got nothing left. I'm just empty. And people were all lining up to say, we're quitting. I can't do this anymore. One family the people had broken into their house. They'd been tied up, and they thought they were going to be executed. And at the last moment, these bright lights began shining in the window, and the guerrillas thought that the army had come. They all took off. And they never did know where those lights came from. They assumed it had to have been God somehow scaring them off before they were executed. And these people were all telling their stories to my parents. And when my dad got there, they said, we don't want to do any business. We don't want to have work on anything. Henry, just speak life into us. We have no life left. And so my dad had brought about several hours worth of sermons. They said, Henry, we've given you 8 hours every day to speak to us. 8 hours. The first day he'd used all of his material. So he got up at 3 o'clock the next morning. And he said, God, these people are desperate. These people, they don't need a religious platitude. They don't need some kind of cliche. They need a word from you. God, I don't dare get up in front of these people and pull out some dusty old sermon I used 10 years ago. They've got to have a fresh word from Almighty God. And so my dad's up at like 3 in the morning, and he's just frantically writing and searching and trying to find truths from God. What do you say to a missionary who's gone all the way to Africa only to be raped by the very people she's trying to share the gospel with? How do you comfort a missionary wife who lost her child because they were fleeing from the very people they were ministering to as they were trying to kill them? And so my dad said, God, what do I say to people like that? And I'll tell you what, I've talked to missionaries who were in that meeting, and they said it was like the glory of God just fell. And they said, we all knew that we were on holy ground. And they said, we didn't want your dad to stop. At one point, about the third day in, someone said, look, we have an hour set aside for recreation. Why don't we forget about recreation and give Henry a 9th hour to teach us? And I think my mother actually vetoed that, said 8 hours is enough. You need a break. But what we didn't know is some people, they turned on a tape recorder. They started taping all that my dad was saying. And later, years later, they transcribed that. And if any of you, probably some of you have done the Experiencing God Day by Day devotional that I wrote with my dad. When we were doing that, I got the transcript of all the things that he had said to those missionaries. And I put them into a bunch of those devotionals. We're taken right out of that. The devotional won the Devotional of the Year award that year. But I'll tell you what, my dad was just coming from those meetings when he came up to pick me up. And I could just always tell with my dad, because my dad hadn't arrived yet. The people are starting to fill the room up. They're hoping, they said, has your dad made it yet? I said, well, I think he's close. I know that they should be getting here any minute. I've got a little song and dance I can do until he gets here, if you like. And then sure enough, I saw my parents come in. I said, Dad, you've got the next hour and a half. I'm going to sit down. Just tell them what God's been saying to you. And I could always tell. I could just look at my dad's face, and I knew that God had just been filling his cup to overflowing. And whenever there was a crisis, whenever there was a tragedy going on in the world, my dad would have the news on, and he'd have his Bible in his hand. He'd be just saying, God, help me to understand what's going on. Give me a word for your people. And I'll tell you, all I can just tell you is my dad began speaking the next hour and a half. He had no notes, just had his Bible, and he said, let me tell you what God has been showing me the last 2 weeks. And I'll tell you what, I just wish I could beam every one of you into that room. Because you just want to take your shoes off. Because you just knew that this was not just advice, the same advice he gave everybody. This was fresh, hot off the press from God to my dad. Now we're getting it first. And I'll tell you what, it just blew everybody away. You didn't want the time to end. An hour and a half went by just like that. But what you realized was my dad had a lot to give. Folks, if you want to be a blessing to the people you mentor, you can't give what you don't have. So make sure you've got lots to give. And keep it fresh. Keep it personal. Keep it God-centered. And then third, just provide examples. Elijah, if you watch what happens in 2 Kings, when Elisha is now following Elijah, the king sends 3 cohorts of 50 soldiers to arrest Elijah, and Elijah on the first 2 calls fire down, obliterates them. And the third commander comes up and falls on the ground and begs Elijah not to kill all of them too. And then Elijah comes along, and they come to the Jordan River, and he takes his mantle and he strikes the water is part, it goes across. So when Elijah turned around and said to Elisha, hey, let me tell you how things work, you knew to pay attention. Because Elijah was always giving examples. Elijah he wasn't just saying, do this, he was saying, let me show you how to do this. I'm not going to talk to you about the power of God. I'm going to show you the power of God, and then you'll know. I've just found that great leadership is caught more than it's taught. Just show them what it looks like to be a great leader. Don't keep telling them. Show them how it looks to be a person of integrity, to be a person of faith, a person of robust work ethic. Don't just tell them that's what you want them to do. Go first. My son Mike will be here coming in tonight. Years ago, our ministry was doing leadership conferences all over the country, and my dad would be there, I'd be there, my brother, Rick Fisher, was speaking, and we'd usually bring one of my kids along. They didn't always do a plenary session, but they do a seminar for how to reach young people, how to understand their culture, and so on. So this time it was my son Mike. And so I want to show Mike, how to conduct yourself when you're in a conference, and how to talk to others, how to prepare your message, how to be relevant. And so I'm showing him how to do that. And then at the end, the last message was, I was preaching on joy, how to lead and yet don't lose your joy. Get into fix problems, address ugly, messy issues, but hold on to your joy. And at the end, we had an altar call, and the whole front is just filled with people just returning to the Lord. And it's just this glorious time, and I'm so happy that my son is there to watch that, and I'm hoping he's just soaking it up, and the next generation just seeing how Blackaby's minister. And so then we're going to go for dinner. And I can't remember if Rick is driving, but we had a big really big van for our team. We're all going to go to some restaurant. And I decide, I'm sort of inspired. I'm 6'2". I was the tallest guy on our team. And so normally I'd sat up at the front. But I thought, you know what? One more opportunity to demonstrate to my son servanthood. I need to take a turn at the very back of the van, just like everybody else. So I've just preached this glorious sermon. The altar's just been filled. What a great time to show him that I can go to the back like everybody else. So I'm climbed all the way to the fourth row back. And we had to turn the seat down to get back there. I get back there. I'm trying to pull the seat back up so someone can sit in that row, but it's locked. And I can't figure out, you got to pull on something. So the seat back comes up. So I'm digging around trying to figure it out. Well, Mike comes up to help me. And just as Mike figures out how to do this, I have inadvertently put my hand right between two major metal parts. And Mike gets it loose and then heaves it back. And it just crushes about two of my fingers. I mean, there's blood just pouring out. And just excruciating. It is closed right to the bone. And I can just tell I'm not feeling joy at that moment. And I'm thinking to myself, but my son has just watched me talk about ministering in the Spirit. My last sermon was about, don't let things take your joy away. And he was about to see me lose my joy right there. And can I just tell you, you can sit down and mentor young people for hours on end, and then one careless moment, one unguarded moment, and you've just negated every mentoring session that you had with them. And I've just found that the best mentoring is going to ultimately come when you live your life out, pain and all, in front of young people, and you show them how you face the difficult times. How you keep your joy when your fingers are crushed. And by the grace of God, I didn't say anything I had to retract later. I just said, open the seat. And he's like, I can't get this thing to lock in. I keep pushing on it. It's like I'm about to pass out from loss of blood. But I'll tell you something. After I could have talked to my son about self-control and everything else. And I don't say this to brag about myself. I feel like God was just saying to me, your son can listen to you preach on the platform all day long, but you hurt yourself getting in the car later, and all those sermons are for naught if you can't live and suffer in front of them. By the way, through COVID, we all had a chance to endure pain in front of others, didn't we? We all had to suffer in various ways, and the younger generation watched us dealing with adversity like we'd never dealt with before. They watched whether we were anxious and worried and troubled, or whether we still had the joy of the Lord, we still had the peace of God, or we were just as anxious as our atheist competitors down the street. Did Christ make any difference in our life or not? And I'll tell you what, sometimes the greatest lessons you will teach those you're mentoring is how you deal with adversity. and they watch you in real time as a Christian trying to deal with it. And they see how real leaders, spiritual leaders, deal with the hard moments that are going to come in all of our lives. And then finally, let me just mention and finish well. Finish well. Now, Elijah finishes in a whirlwind of fire being swept up into heaven. he finishes well. Now, a couple of chapters back, he was suicidal, wanting to quit. I'm so glad he didn't end there. Now, you may have those moments, but don't end there. If you ever find yourself in those hopeless places, say, God, don't let this be the end of my story. God, come and help me get out of this dark place. I want to finish well. And I don't have to tell you of the examples of people that had years of success, years of speaking on the platform, years of writing books, and then they didn't finish well. And I just grieve every time I see that. I've got lots of friends who've not ended well. People that I know that breaks my heart because I know how awful it must be for them to have just tarnished a great reputation. So many people that respected them and looked to them as a mentor. And then now they're confused. Can I believe anything that person said? Were they lying to me the whole time? Or was there truth in what they were saying? I'll tell you what, the greatest gift you can give those you mentor is still be racing all out when you get to the finish line. Still be going hard, holding on to the joy that God gave you. I tell you, with my mother and father, watching them now, these two giants of faith, but now they're at the end. And I was, the other day, about 2 weeks ago, my mom was still at home, and she was sitting in her chair, not able to do a lot. And I brought my daughter over with me, and I said, we're over there ministering to my mother, and her feet were hurting her. We found out later she had blood clots, but her feet were hurting. And my mother, for years, she was always into some, I don't know, she wasn't really on the internet a lot, but she always found out some new wonderful cure-all kind of lotion or drink or oil or something that she would just have it in her purse, and she'd want to rub it all over you every time she saw you. You're like, Mom, please, don't. Like, I'm about to get up and speak. But this will make you feel a lot better, And she, for quite a while, she had this foot lotion that she said, your feet, stuff absorbs in there, goes to your whole body. And so she was always, every time I'd meet up with my parents somewhere where we were both going to speak, and my mom would say, take your shoes off. Let me rub this on your feet. And Mom, don't do that to me. I just feels awkward. My mother, rubbing my feet, you shouldn't do that. But she would insist. And so she did that for years. All of her kids, all of her grandkids have all had her rub their feet. And so she starts complaining about her feet, and I just had this thought. I said, hey, where's that foot stuff that you're always putting on us? That would be perfect. I said, listen, it's time for me to do that for you. I said, I would be happy to rub your feet, Mom. That's something I could do for you. Where is it? I'm going to find it. And I come back, I'm all set. This will be great. I can just show my mom one more time how much I love her. And my daughter, Carrie, says, no, Dad, let me do that. I'm like, I'm going to rub someone's feet. Are you sure? She said, Dad, please, let me do that. My daughter was just desperate to find some way to show my mother how much she loved her. She said, that's perfect. Let me be the one who does that. And so that's the picture I took of my mother's oldest granddaughter, just spending a special time ministering to her grandmother. Last time she'd have a chance to do something quite like that. And I thought to myself, you know what? That's a mark of someone who finishes well. When your grandkids are fighting over who gets to rub your feet because they can't thank you enough for what you invested in their life. My parents have 14 grandkids, and when the word came out that my mom was dying, all 14, but Mike is the last one. You can pray for him. Before we knew how serious my mother was, the plan was for Mike, when he was coming here to speak, when we found out my mom had liver cancer, Rick changed his flight schedule so he could come from here to Atlanta and see his grandmother. I don't know that she'll still be alive on Wednesday. We're trying to get Mike back. He's the only one of 14 grandkids who's not yet seen my mom. And it just blew me away. Kids were leaving medical school and driving from Texas just to see Grandma one last time. Every one of her grandkids, all the ones who live in Canada, all of them, every one of them made it down to tell her how much they appreciate her. And I thought to myself, that's finishing well. You know, the interesting thing, by the way, when both parents got kind of weak, we hired a nurse to come in and care for them. They're in a home that gets a lot of care, but we just want to have extra care for them. So we hired this nurse. And she's really good. She comes in the mornings and would kind of help get them ready, and at night kind of come in and help personally make sure they're all cleaned up, ready for bed, and dressed right. And she seemed like a real nice woman. We found out, now, you know, my dad's never going to preach another sermon. He's never going to write another book. He doesn't communicate all that well anymore. But you know what? My brother-in-law one day was in there when that nurse was there, and this nurse is just so impressed by my parents. She kept saying, "These people are such people of God." She said, "I've never met." And I remember saying to her one day, I said, "Well, you know, if you had known them in their prime," I said, "now you're cleaning up after them and brushing their teeth for them." And I said, "But if you'd known them years ago," I said, "you'd know what amazing people these are that you're caring for right now." And she said, "Oh, I can tell." She said, "I can tell even now that these are awesome people of God." And I said, "Well, they are. You could ask anyone who knows them." I said, "I'm just sorry that you kind of didn't get to know them until the very end of their lives." And you know what happened about a week ago? My brother-in-law was over there, got into a spiritual conversation with her, found out she wasn't a believer, and led her to Christ there in the room with my parents. And I thought to myself, even when my parents can't go out and tell people about Jesus anymore, God's still bringing the people into their assisted living community and letting them find Christ even there. And you know what? Yesterday morning, that nurse showed up at our church for the very first time and texted us and said, "Hey, I'm at your church, and it's awesome." She got to see my 2 grandsons baptized yesterday. And I thought to myself, my parents may never be able to travel again, but God, they're still being used by God to bring people into the kingdom of God. And I just had to pray and say, "God, I pray as my grandkids watch me, as the younger generation watches me, I hope they never see me slowing down, never growing weary, never becoming cynical, never saying, 'I've done my part, let the younger generation do it next.' May they still see me just trying to do one more thing for God while there's time to do it. Just blessing one more person, speaking life into one more person before my time is done. And I pray that you will do the same." I'll tell you what, there's no greater privilege you could have than to invest in the next generation. You might want to bring fire down. You might want to raise the dead. But I'll tell you, nothing beats speaking into the next generation and blessing them and launching your own Elishas into a world that desperately needs a touch of God. Well, let me pray with you, and I'll be done. Lord, thank you for these who've come, these good, dear friends, Lord, you use these people in this room. You bless so many in this room. And I pray, Lord, you teach us how to multiply ourselves. Lord, it wouldn't just be us. The world doesn't just need a worn-out Elijah. It needs a whole host of Elishas rising up behind us. Lord, some of us may feel weary. We may feel like we've done all that we can. And yet I pray that we'll hear your Spirit speak to us even now and say, "But your best days still lie ahead, not behind." God, help us not to slow down, but to gear up. For we have more today to give than we've ever had before. We know you better than we ever have. We know your word better than we ever have. Lord, we've had more experiences with you than we've ever had. So God, use us this day to produce more spiritual fruit, more changed lives, and may we bring more glory to God today than we ever have before. And I'd pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.